So this is Jack Kornfield. Says, the unawakened mind tends to make war against the way things are. To follow a path with heart, we must understand the whole process of making war within ourselves and without, how it begins and how it ends. Without understanding, we can easily become frightened by life's fleeting changes, inevitable losses, disappointments, the insecurity of our aging and death. Misunderstanding leads us to fight against life. So it's said that this path is a path of wisdom, that in an important sense, wisdom is, we find wisdom at the beginning of the path, and the path culminates in wisdom. Sayadaw Tejaniya, Burmese monk, said that, made this interesting comment that he feels like, you know, the notion of like you have to, you know, invest some money to grow money. And he said the same thing about wisdom. We actually have to invest wisdom to grow wisdom from the beginning of the path. And so it's not an accident that the Eightfold Path begins with wise view, with a kind of element of wisdom. And in a way, I think the kind of label wisdom itself is a little vague. You know, like what exactly does that mean? And as the scope of science has expanded, science has actually started to encroach on territories that previously had been reserved for religion or philosophy or something. But researchers have actually recently started to ask the question, like in this case, there's a couple psychiatrists, psychiatric researchers, who asked the question like, what is wisdom? And what is wisdom at the level of the brain? And so a few years ago, they wrote a piece titled The Neurobiology of Wisdom. And in a prominent kind of respected psychiatry journal. And they write that wisdom is a unique psychological construct, not just a collection of desirable traits with a convenient unifying label. You know? So their argument was that wisdom is actually, this is actually a thing that we can define, and it's not just like a word we use as a placeholder for like lots of good stuff, you know, right? You know what I mean? And it's like, this is a thing. And the point of their article, they went on actually to highlight some of the brain regions that maybe are sort of associated with wisdom, some of the neurobiological correlates of wisdom, which incidentally overlap quite a bit with the correlates of mindfulness practice. But that's for another conversation. What I actually wanted to highlight was the 6 components of wisdom that they arrived at based on their kind of research. And it's kind of remarkable, these 6 components of wisdom, how much they dovetail with our practice, with what we're doing. So the first, pro-social attitudes and behaviors. Second, value tolerance. tolerating the values and views of others, self-understanding, acknowledging and dealing effectively with uncertainty and ambiguity, emotional balance, and kind of interpersonal skill in social decisions. And so I saw that, and it's just so resonant with the kinds of things that we're cultivating. So I wanted to say a few words about some of these and the way that our practice actually cultivates these different facets of what the researchers called wisdom. So, pro-social values, right? Mindfulness, in a certain sense, we might say it's defined by being some very pro-social values, but maybe more precisely, mindfulness is really defined by the absence of anti-social values, yeah? Meaning that mindfulness is defined as a kind of way of awareness that is drained of craving and aversion. And so the question is like, what's left when we've distilled out the greed and the hatred, the aversion? Like, what's actually left? And so, John Kabat-Zinn, who's like really been a major voice in developing mindfulness, said, look, if you don't hear heartfulness in the mindfulness, you're misunderstanding what this practice is. And of course, we have a very kind of explicit focus on compassion and kindness and forgiveness, right? And there are whole traditions that where compassion is at the center, is sort of the center of what practice is about. I remember some years ago, I was listening to a talk, and the teacher, Rob Burbia, was quoting Shantideva, this sort of Tibetan sage, and at some point Shantideva said something said to himself, like, mind, speaking to his own mind, please understand you don't belong to me. And in this context, what he meant was that the mind actually belongs, is dedicated to the welfare of all beings. And there was something about that touched me very, very deeply to, in a certain sense, like radically offer one's own mind to the welfare of others. But this is the aspiration, I think the bodhisattva aspiration for one's life to be of deepest benefit. Yeah. Now, I think we can have these deep kind of heartfelt experiences of love, of a kind of boundless, non-discriminating love. But ultimately there's a question, like, okay, does it change behavior, right? Okay, well, metta practice went well tonight, but am I a dick on the street as soon as I leave, So there were a couple research studies about this, actually. Because you can't ask people, are you kind? Because it's hard for people to evaluate themselves honestly, right? So what they did was they set up this whole elaborate kind of ruse to evaluate whether people would act in a compassionate way. Maybe I shared this a couple years ago. It was a couple studies in 2013 and 14. And so some people did a 8-week mindfulness course. Some people did a compassion course. Some people got nothing. They were in the study, but they didn't get any compassion or mindfulness. And then they set up the evaluation. So at the end of the study, they said, okay, you have to come down to the research lab, and we need you to fill out some paperwork, that kind of stuff. And when they got to the research, waiting room, there were 3 chairs. 2 chairs were taken, 1 chair was empty, and they're invited to sit down. Okay, so now all 3 chairs are taken, right? Now the 2 people sitting next to them, the research subject, were in on it. They're part of the research team, right? They look like they're just there to do their paperwork, but they're actually in on it. They're sitting, they're not getting up, right? So all 3 chairs are taken. Then comes in another member of the research team with you wouldn't know, but a fake broken leg, right? So she walks in limping with a boot, and then sees all 3 chairs are taken, right? And she leans back against the wall and sighs and is like, and it's kind of like, all right, good people, give me your chair, right? So then the research question is, does the research subject sitting in the middle chair get up to offer their chair? And do the people who got mindfulness or compassion do that more than the people who didn't get any meditation, right? So I wouldn't be sharing this if it were like the meditators got up less, But, yeah, so fortunately for this Dharma talk, the meditators got up, I think at a rate 3 times of what the control group got up at. And there was no difference, actually, between the people who got compassion practice and the people who did mindfulness. So it's a couple studies and more, they're small studies, but it's still instructive. So pro-social values, value tolerance. Fundamentalism, in a way, is really is kind of the height of arrogance. And one of my main teachers, Shinzen Young, said, he said that he saw a kind of spectrum where on one end of the spectrum is fundamentalism and the other end of the spectrum is mysticism. And in an important sense, the Buddhist path is a mystical path. It's a path that actually celebrates modes of awareness, ways of being that are not ordinary, that are the fruit of cultivation. And I think what we find is that as we get quieter, we have less and less need to believe anything. And as we get quieter, we have less and less need to say anything, to claim anything about the world. Maybe you even feel this, perhaps at the end of a meditation period, where it just feels like we don't need to say anything, we don't need to believe anything, we certainly don't need to convince anyone of anything. Yeah? That whole realm feels remote. And, I think that the truth is that we come to love this path more and more deeply, but we come to hold it more and more lightly. So I was teaching a retreat last month with somebody who's done 30 years of very significant practice, and spent a lot of time in Burma, and did a year-long retreat, self-retreat, and has devoted his life really to the practice. But we were teaching together, we were teaching a teen retreat, and he said to the kids that, I don't know if this is your path. I don't know that you should meditate. I don't insist on that for anyone. Yeah. And I think he genuinely meant it. Yeah. It's like the kind of urge, the evangelical urge, the urge to make one's own truth somebody else's, that really can get quiet. And it's not, I think, an accident that, it's said that at the first stage of enlightenment, the first taste of awakening, one of the things that falls away from the mind is a kind of attachment. The usual translation is attachment to rites and rituals. But in an important sense, it's really attachment to conventions. And so, as we actually become more tolerant of the views of others, as we become less attached to our own views, as we feel less kind of emotional compulsion to demonstrate what we believe. Interestingly, as we become less attached in those ways, we become more persuasive. Right? Like, who wants to listen to somebody shoving their views down your throat? Right? But there's a certain kind of dignity in non-attachment. So when I hear somebody say something that I can feel is free from attachment, I really want to hear. Yeah? Because their agenda is not investment in their own views. They're saying it for something else, some other reason. A line from Actually, I think we'll actually got to stop, but I'll pick this up. Some of the ways that this practice dovetails with these facets of wisdom, but it's quite remarkably resonant, and so offer this for your consideration. So let's just sit for a moment. So may the goodness of our intentions and efforts, may this be offered out in all directions. May our humble little practice be a force for less suffering, more joy, more safety.